In this video, we're going to be talking about information security, giving you a little bit more details of what it means within an organisation, and also talking a little bit about the international standard ISO 27001. So, information is basically an asset in your organisation. Just like any other business asset, it has a value to an organisation. Now, depending upon the organisation you work in, that asset will have a different value and ultimately could have different risk associated to it. And therefore, like any asset, it should come with some form of protection and management within your business. So let's just go back a little bit and think about information itself when we're talking about information security. Many people think that this is simply just related to IT, laptops, IT security in terms of infrastructure, but actually that's not the case. When we talk about information, we mean how it exists in a multitude of different forms. This can be printed and written documentation. It can be information stored electronically, transmitted by post or any electronic means. It can also include visual information, could be videos, could be sound bites, it could be diagrams, and it can be information also that you possibly publish on your website. It can also include phone calls and recorded webinars and things like that. So it's important to understand also the life cycle of information. And information can be created in different forms. It can be owned as an asset internally and externally within your business. It can also be given access to people outside of your organisation, for example, third-party suppliers, customers, and even members of the public. It can also include the life cycle of information of how long it lasts once it's on the website, once it's out there in a portal, and also it can be considered in terms of how it's transmitted and communicated, so how that data gets to its source, whether by email, through Dropboxes, etc., etc. It's also important to recognise that the information lifecycle does also include data that is updated, information that has changed to other revisions, and what happens to the previous versions. Likewise, it's also important to remember when we talk about deleting or destroying data, we have to remember in this world of cloud data storage that often when something is seen to be deleted, may not actually be deleted. So what are we talking about? It's about basically keeping our information, which is valuable to us, free from danger. So how we protect it, keep it safe from harm, and also how we ensure that we protect ourselves from breaches of access to that data. It's not something you buy, it's not necessarily something you do, it's a process that you have to follow in order to ensure that these security measures that you put in place are relevant for the risks to your business. And it's achieved by a combination of technology, but also humans, how we interact with the data, how we follow the policies and processes and procedures that are put to us. We use a terminology called CIA, which refers to the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information. We were looking to avoid, prevent, detect, and recover from incidents when they do happen. And it is important to say the word when, because ultimately every organisation that handles information will have some sort of incident at some point in time and have to be prepared in how they recover from it. We have to think about securing the processes that we have to follow, the technology that we use, the data that we store, whether electronically or not, and the people that are accessing or we are giving access. So remember, it's not just about our IT department. They're there as a provision to support on the infrastructure. So let's think about a little bit around security elements for an effective information security management system. So let's think about people. So this is people who may or may not have an interest in the information that we store. So this can be high-level owners, shareholders and directors of business. This can be the regular management and staff, depending on what level they are. It can also be our customers and clients, our suppliers and even business partners. And what about service providers, contractors, external consultants that we share information with in order for them to help us in our business? And of course, we have to think about authorities, regulators and external bodies that we may have to interact with. So typically our biggest threats come from people. They come from people who are challenged through being fraudsters, hackers, whatever that may be, to try and access information if they believe it has a value on the open market, or whether they believe just disruption is enough for them to do it. So we think about people being our biggest assets, but we also have to think about people being our biggest weakness in information security. Our processes are our work activities that we do, and every business is a little bit different. These are the workflows that show what it is that we do as an organisation and how we undertake them. So how we accomplish our business objectives. Processes may then be described in more detail by procedures and work instructions. Virtually all of our business processes involve or depend upon some form of information. Some of that information may be extremely critical and sensitive. Some of that information may be less so and could be placed in the public domain. So information security policies, processes, procedures, they should then be developed to define what information we retain, how appropriate it is, and how secure it needs to be. Then, of course, we have our technology, the methods in how we transfer information, how we access information, how we store information. And this can be anything from our smartphones or tablets that we might use, the Wi-Fi that we operate within, the cabling that may be used within the office for our network infrastructure. There could be backup systems, servers, and of course these days we have to think about the cloud. We also have to think about other things that are regularly used by our staff and workers. That could be things like USB drives and portable disk drives that may be used as separate backups. Similarly, we have to think about how people access this data. Do we allow them to use their own laptops or computers at home to access our data inside the office or on the cloud? If that is the case, how confident are we? What levels of security do we have in place associated to the technology? Especially when we think that possibly those computers may also be used by other members of the family at home. So we have to think about the barriers of control that are required within our organisation using technology to protect the information we provide. So, information security is valuable because it protects our information first and foremost against threat. And anyone will know, if you read the press or watch the news, we will hear regularly about breaches in large organisations, and it's only the large ones that we see. We hear about breaches in NHS, we hear about breaches in local authority, we hear about breaches in Facebook, we hear about it in airlines. So it's only the big, ones that really hit the press. What we have to remember is that this happens on a regular basis, very, very often, to smaller organisations that we might not see in the press. We have to think about how valuable it is to us to secure that information. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to try and ensure a level of business continuity within our organisation and visually outside our organisation, what we present to our clients and customers. One of the main purposes for the information security is that we want to minimize the threat, because not only the loss of the information is a threat, but also the impact it can have on our finances and our time and our business continuity. And ultimately, all of these things cost us time and money to put right. Many organizations that suffer from these threats, the cost to put these corrections in place is exceptionally high and exceptionally time consuming. So we want to optimize our return on investment of the information security system we put in. In order to understand what level of information security we must have, we must first understand how important that information is to our business and to our customers. We must then also understand what the risks are to our business continuity and any possible reputational threat that might bring. And therefore, we must design our information security management system around our needs and the needs and expectations of our interested parties. I mentioned before about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So this is defined as the preservation of how we control this information. So making information accessible only to those authorized to use it. This includes external third parties. So what activities do we have to put in place if information has to be classed as confidential? What about in terms of safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of that information and the processing methods we use? And this is around the integrity and the infrastructure that we have. And then lastly, what about the availability? So if we are stating that information is available, are we 100% confident that it's available as and when it is needed? So therefore, what we're referring to there in terms of availability is the likes of the uptime of our access areas, like our cloud solutions or our servers. What about the impacts? So we have IT downtime, business interruption. Of course, that comes with financial losses and additional costs. What about devaluation of our business and of the information and intellectual property that we may retain if we have lost the control around that and the integrity around that? Let's go a little bit further than that. We now have laws in place around this, and we have had for a long, long time, but they are much more relevant and out there now for more businesses to follow. In the likes of Europe, we have GDPR. So could we be breaking the law or breaking rules and regulations which have been put in place? Is there a possibility that this could lead to prosecution, where we maybe have fines or penalties? And you will be aware again that you see these things in the press. What about our reputation? What about if we are one of the companies that land ourselves in the press? Or maybe just information that is shared on social media platforms like LinkedIn or YouTube around impact that has happened to our business or impact that we have caused on one of our customers. There is also fear and uncertainty around this. So if we are hacked or attacked once, could it happen again? And what impact could that have in the future if it's happened once before? So let's just scrape back a little bit and think about risk itself. So risk is the possibility that a threat exploits a vulnerability in an information asset, leading to an adverse impact on our organisation and of course extended beyond our organisation to our suppliers, our customers, etc. So when we think about threat, it's something that might cause harm. So this is a bit like a hazard when we think about health and safety. What about vulnerability? So this is the weakness that might be exploited. So how vulnerable are our systems? How vulnerable are our people? And what about the impact? The impact is, for this threat, we may be quite vulnerable, but the impact may be quite minimal. For another threat, we may have lesser vulnerability, but the impact is so significant if it happens, we may have to put additional controls in place. So when we look at risk in the centre, we talk about the controls we put in place to try and reduce the risk, and that reduction of that risk is to the threat against our information assets. And around that, we have our threats and our vulnerabilities, our security requirements, and our value. So the greater value we have in our information assets, and remember, this is not the technology, this is anything associated to information, then the risk associated may increase. And if that increases, we therefore want to identify additional security requirements, which then means that we have to increase our control levels. And if we increase our control levels, we automatically look to protect ourselves against these threats. And ultimately, these threats are where they try to exploit our vulnerabilities. And as the threats and vulnerabilities increase, therefore does our risk. So therefore, we have to continually review what is happening within our business, monitor what these potential threats and vulnerabilities are, possibly do desktop exercises to see if we are in a good position with the controls that we have, and ultimately look to do this directly in proportion to our business requirements. So threat agents can come from human, machine, or even nature. So where there can be a situation where people are taken out of the workplace because of something that has happened outside our control. Or it could be that our systems have gone down as a result of something outside of our control, like a large fire or flood, for example. We also have to think about motive. So what is it that causes this threat agent to act? Is it a deliberate act? Is it an accidental error by someone in your organisation clicking on something by mistake that has came in via email? Do you have the correct levels and barriers in place to control if something like that happens? So you've got to think about what the intention of it is. So why is the person wanting to do this? Is it just disruption? Is it to achieve something? Is it financial gain? Or is it simply just from an accident? So of course there are a multitude of threat types. And in this slide, we just simply talk about some of the threat types that are out there, where it's down to human error, where they have sent something by mistake to the wrong email address, where they have created information incorrectly and sent it to the wrong place, where someone has physically lost a laptop or lost a phone by mistake, or even it's been stolen as a result of the fact that those devices may have greater level of access and not enough security features to allow the person that steals the device or finds the device to access information. What about in terms of intellectual property? So is it possible that your intellectual property is worth something, not just to you as a business, but to someone else that can gain access to that? So therefore, is it possible that piracy or some sort of industrial espionage, sounds like 007, but is your intellectual property worth something outside of your business to someone else? And therefore, this may drive the threat agent to act on this. What about a deliberate act? So unauthorized access or trespassing into a building to access information. What about actually deliberately going in to disrupt data which is held on your systems? Maybe try to delete it, maybe try to steal that data. What about if that information is used to blackmail people? And we do hear about it. You know, depending on where that information is stored and what that information is it possible it can be used as some form of extortion against people? Or simply just a form of vandalism or terrorist attack or criminal activity just to disrupt something that's going on? Okay? We also have fraud as well, where it may be that people within your organisation have a financial gain by taking information out of your company and selling it to someone else. So they're effectively, stealing information for financial gain for themselves. What about people that create some form of fraud in terms of identity theft, where they may have access to personal records from data within your company and information held within your company on other people outside? It could be members of the public. There could be credit card information, passport information, addresses, dates of birth, next of kin, all the types of information that you need probably for someone to create some form of fraud. And then we've got the more common thing that we see, which is the virus and system network attacks around the viruses and the worms to try and create some sort of data outage, to try and inundate the systems with lots of activity going on and slow things down. We have all heard about these different viruses and bugs and threats going about that can have this type of impact. And of course, our information security practices, the ones that come from the likes of Microsoft and places like that, they're continually monitoring these and looking to put control measures and methods in place to act against those. So it's a continual battle against what those potential attacks could be. And then we've got things like service issues, power going down, network outages, floods or fires that could come from some form of natural resource, like lightning that could cause our power to trip, and therefore our internal networks may not have the capability to come back on. And if they do come back on, they may come back on in a very different way, and therefore people may not be able to access the information they need to, or access the locations. What about in terms of our assets themselves? So data that cannot be stored because of lack of capacity in our systems, and people start to use other ways and means of storing data. What about in terms of power supplies that fail on our systems? And then of course we've got software issues. Could be that those software issues are a result of software that we develop or we work with a partner or a third party. Could it be that there are flaws in those that cause some sort of threat as well? So how do we secure our information assets? So remember, it's important first of all to recognise what they are, what our information is within our business, understanding what the risks are to that data if there was a threat on it, or the risk to the technology that's used to transfer the data, or the people within our business which are in control of these assets and this information. We have to understand what the threats are first to our business, to then look at what measures we put in place to control it and secure it. So this is leading us on to a little bit of a background information on where ISO 27001 came from. So information security codes of practice came about in the 1990s and originated from a British standard which was put in place. And then this was adopted by ISO, where they started to produce ISO standards around 27,000. And in the 2000 era, then this is when there was the ability to be certified against this standard. And of course, we are seeing a significant growth in the amount of information that people and businesses hold. We're seeing a significant growth in the technology that's used for that information to transfer and storage, and the way in which we get access to data is more readily available to us. And therefore, we are seeing more and more opportunities for threat and people to act upon this to cause disruption or take access to that information. And as a result of that, more and more requirements we see in industry for companies to show some form of information security management practices that they have in place. And really, as time goes on, we're going to see more and more organisations requiring to demonstrate certification of some level against the likes of ISO 27001. This may become more of a requirement in situations in tendering activities, for example, or contractual frameworks and things like that. So, ISO 27001 concerns itself with the management of information security. It's not all about IT, it's not all about the technical security, it's about the practices we put in place, the processes we have, and of course, the people that manage them. So, it uses, similar to ISO 9001 and other standards, it uses a Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA to achieve and maintain the activities we do, but importantly, to always review and act upon improving our systems and processes against information security threats. And it covers all types of organisations. 27001, just like 9001, can be picked up and utilised by any type of organisation. So it's not relevant to specific companies, and therefore it may be beneficial to anything from a not-for-profit charity type organisation through to large government agencies and everything in between. There are already a huge amount of organisations that have gone through the process of being certified to 27001. It's still quite a long way from quality management in terms of 9000, but we are seeing a much more significant focus on 27001 as the years go by. So if you're not familiar with PDCA, let me talk about it in a little bit more detail. Plan, Do, Check, Act. So plan is establishing our information security management system. What we plan to do to put the level of protection that we need, that we put the level of barriers and controls that are required. We train and communicate with our workforce and our other stakeholders to work within the realms of our information security management system. And then we act upon that. So we deliver the services we wish to deliver, utilising our information security management system. We then check. So this is the monitoring and measurement we do associated to the normal activities that we undertake. So how well have we performed? How many people have clicked on potential virus emails? How many times has there been a threat to us that we've recorded? How many times has there been a downtime in the services outside of our business we use, cloud services or other software technologies? And therefore, what impact has that had on us? And therefore, we want to then act upon that to improve it. So, plan is establishing our systems and putting them in place, the objectives we want to try and achieve. Do is implementing and operating that management system along with our normal operational activities. Checking is really looking to see that we have done what we plan to achieve. And act is where we want to try and maintain and improve upon those services. So in terms of the control clauses within ISO 27001, remember all of this is associated to the confidentiality, the integrity and the availability of information. So we may start off with having information security policies, organisation of information security in terms of who is going to be responsible, who is going to take accountability for this and put the appropriate roles and responsibilities in place, possibly with additional training. What about in terms of management of our assets and our human resources? So how do we ensure that people are following what we want them to do? What about our physical security? Our offices, our work sites? What is the vulnerability of our assets or our information contained within these locations? Is it possible that people can gain access quite simply? What about our communication and operational management? Using the technology to share the information, how well is that controlled? What about in terms of development of our systems that we use? Some of them may be software related, they may be web-based, cloud-based. We may utilise third parties to do that. How confident are we that we have the correct practices in place to ensure that we are compliant with what we want to try and achieve? And then let's think about incidents. They happen, they will happen. So how good are we at planning to address these incidents? How good are we at recovering from incidents? And importantly, improving from those incidents, identifying what the true root cause is and putting the relevant and appropriate controls in place to defend ourselves against them. And all along we have to think about this in terms of how that impacts on our normal business activities. That can result in erosion of profit, erosion of our reputation. So business continuity planning also is really important associated to this. So talking a little bit more detail about the clauses within 27001, we have to think about information security policies, the information security, which is the management framework that we have to implement in our business. Remember, this isn't about a management system that sits on a shelf somewhere or sits in someone's desk, folder structure, whatever that may be. This is about a management system that is implemented across the business, because the vulnerability and the threat really associated to this type of activity is ultimately your weakest link. So if you have a number of employees that are not following the system, doesn't mean that you have not implemented it effectively, or does it mean that they are deliberately not following it and management interaction is required? What about in terms of our assets? Are we classifying those assets in terms of the impact they could have on our business and the sensitivity of the data that's stored within them, or the access they have to different information? So we have to think about how vulnerable those assets are, where they're used as well. And then we have to think about human resources. Humans, as I said, are one of the most important factors. What about these people that come into our business? And importantly, what about the people that leave our business that may still have access to information on the cloud? They may have ways and means of gaining access to information. What about our physical and environmental threats that we have within our business, within our systems, within our offices and our workshops and our warehouses? And then falling back onto Plan, Do, Check, Act, we have to think about the implementation life cycle that we put in place. So what policies we put in place, how we identify the security threats within our organisation, how we identify and classify the assets within our business. And remember, the assets means the information assets, not necessarily the IT assets. And how about the control and implementation of this? And what interaction they have with our operational or day-to-day operational processes. And then what about how we check and see, is this happening the way we expect it to happen? And of course, we have to put corrective and improvement measures in place. And ideally, they need to be preventative so that in the future, they don't return. The same problems don't return over and over again because of a weakness in our corrective and improvement actions. And then, of course, as part of that, we have to review it at a fairly senior level to identify that the investment we're putting in to our information security management system is bringing about return on investment. So benefits, I've talked about a number of those benefits going through this first period. Obviously, there is a requirement from our legal and regulatory compliance requirement now. There's a demonstration to stakeholders, customers, suppliers, industry bodies that we work with, partners that we work with, joint ventures, we can demonstrate that we have a commitment to information security within our organisation. And also from a commercial credibility, we can provide some level of confidence and assurance to our customers and future customers that we're maybe tendering for work. Ideally, if this works well and we reduce the threats, yes, there has been an investment to do that, but ultimately we should see a reduction in any costs associated to incidents that do occur. And ultimately, we should be using this as a method through risk control measures. So using risk management that might be used in other places within our business, using that methodology to help drive the relevant controls we need to put in place. And of course, we have to think about our employees. We have to think that they could be our weakest links, and therefore how do we put the correct processes in place to ensure that when people join our business and work within our business, that our systems are implemented effectively. We've given them the right support and coaching and give them an avenue to come back to us with and provide feedback if they have concerns. And we want to, from a top-down approach, we want to promote improvement and awareness of information security. I often use a term, people only know what they know until you tell them what you want them to know. And what I really mean by that is many people in your organisation may not know the impact of clicking on that link within that email that contains a virus. They might simply see it just as, well, this has had an impact on my computer. I just switch it off and turn it back on and everything's fine. Unknown to them, without knowing, there could be other things going on in the background. It's too late. But maybe informing these people of what these potential threats are and the impact of just clicking on that link on that email, how it would come across and what impact it could have in the wider business and the customers. Just taking that time to communicate that information may be much more relevant and beneficial so that employees are aware, and that's one of the important things. And of course, one of the big benefits of a good information security management system that is tested is that you are prepared for emergencies and urgent situations when that threat does happen. And it's important to say when and not if. So we have to think about the scope of our management system itself, what it's associated to in terms of our business. Does it include third parties that we use, external locations that we utilise? So we have to think about the information and how it transfers and is stored within our business. And we have to think also about within our information management system, we have to think about the documentation that is required for people to follow and be aware of. So we have policies, we have processes and procedures that are followed. We maybe have rules that we set within our business, could be house rules, working from home rules, etc. And of course, we may have set standards that we set ourselves as part of our control mechanisms. For example, some Windows security type features. It is important as well that in terms of how we communicate this information, we make people regularly aware of the situation and the potential threat. Telling them once and dropping some documents onto a folder somewhere is not going to be an effective information security management system. It has to be there, be relevant, be reviewed regularly, and you have to be looking to get feedback from your staff and other stakeholders. It's important, part of that documentation is also the monitoring that you undertake and the analysis of the situation that's happening on a daily basis within your business. And based on that analysis, that should drive you to either monitor and control what you have in place or drive improvements where you may have weaknesses. And of course, in terms of monitoring and analysing, you have to think about information that can come to you from outside of your organisation. Other impacts that are known within the industry, within the country, that may be relevant that you need to put in place protection measures and barriers. So It may be that there may be an information security vision within your organisation. So the organisation may wish to have a vision which is to be one of the best at securing information within the industry. And there has to be a mission on how they go about doing that. And this is all good and well, but it's got to come with the meat around the bones. It can't just be a statement of intent. It has to be driven right down through the organisation, and importantly, you have to think about what the weakest links are. So, who is actually ultimately responsible? Well, of course, top-down approach, company owners and boards of directors have to take accountability and have to commit to these systems. They have to commit to the resources needed, the investment possibly in technology, and the time needed for these to work effectively. Once they are well implemented, they become hopefully part of the way you do business and therefore are more integrated within your normal operations. You may need information security manager or a department depending upon the size of your business. You may rely upon a third party to provide that service to you, or maybe someone else within your organisation also has that knowledge and you're sufficiently small enough that that person can take on that role as and when required. What about a response team? So what about when an incident does occur? Do you have a business continuity team? Do you have an emergency response team? Are there different people you rely on that would form this team to ultimately review and make decisions? What about in terms of IT, legal, HR, risk and compliance teams? There are a multitude of different departments that may need to be involved and of course have some form of responsibility. There may also be auditors within your organisation. Again, they could be full-time auditors or they could simply be people that take on that auditing role because they have that competence as and when it's required. One of the key things here is that information security management is everyone's responsibility. If there are some within your organisation that do not see it as their responsibility, they could become the weakest link in your information security management system. So we've spoken about the policy, we've spoken about some form of classification. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So different information and the method of how it's transferred and stored within our business needs to be classified to a level that we understand. Based on that classification, we may have to put additional controls. So if we think about information that is public, this may be information that we put on marketing brochures that we post out. It could be information that's on our website in an open public domain. It could be a press release that we put out. It can be posters or advertising that we may use in various forms. This is public information that is free access. So that, in terms of that level of control that's required around that, it's much more minimal. We then could have different information that may be internal to our business and our other stakeholders. So this could be information in terms of projects that we're working on, training material that we have, or it could be just general company communication emails. It could also include within this our information security management system. We want to keep that internal to us and importantly our records associated to this, but we may be willing to share it with our suppliers or our customers or other stakeholders that we work with. And then of course we've got confidential information or secret information. This may be confidential because it's built into a contract we have with a customer or a contract that we have with a trade body or an industry partner. It could be simply related to our pricing infrastructure that we have that we want to keep confidential to us because it might be very important for the methods and how we win business. It could be around designs or new technology that we are developing that may be driving towards a patent or something else. And it could also be our own financial records. Okay, so it's important to recognize what it is that's confidential and secret to our business, because ultimately within these areas, this is where we need to ensure we have a greatest level of control, and then further down we may have additional control levels as required. So in terms of classification, we have to think about what the information is that could be classified as confidential. We then have to think about the methods of how that information is transferred. And if it's confidential, what methods do we have, what barriers and controls do we have that keep it confidential? And what about in terms of how we store that information and who has access to it? So we have to think more about not just, when we sign a confidentiality agreement with one of our customers around a contract, do we think then about that data or that information we receive from that customer? Who then within our organisation may have access to it? If we have open folder structures within our business, if we've signed a confidentiality agreement and we don't have that within our workforce, is it possible that anyone within our business can gain access to that folder structure? So we have to think about this when we sign these agreements. So the way the classification works is generally set up in this form. We can have additional levels and it's got to be relevant to your business. So we got to think maybe about what is really sensitive, extremely sensitive, and could be classed as secret to our business, if we even have such a thing. And then confidential, internal, and public. And generally this classification is built into a register where we create a classification register that identifies the information and the methodology in how we classify it. So part of the classification that is fed into the register and outside of it is we have to think about the assets themselves. We have to think about our information security controls. So when we know the classification register, we know the assets that are used that feed into this. We then also have to think about our information security register as around the controls that we have in place associated to those assets and the information. So we have to think about some physical security. So there could be user responsibility. So how do we allow people access to information around physical security? We may have certain do and do not rules within our workplace in terms of what's expected and what's not. It may be that we do not allow personnel to use IT devices for their own personal purposes, their own personal emails, browsing the web, for example. Likewise, we may not allow personnel to use their own devices to access company information. So there is no set rule around what is right and what's wrong. It's got to be appropriate for your business risks. What about password guidelines? Do we have rules around our passwords? Do we have driven methodologies built into our systems and our software that force us to have these password guidelines put in place, where we have to change the password regularly and it has to be of a certain methodology in order for the password to be acceptable? What about the things that we don't want to happen? Well, if we don't want people just to keep using the same passwords all the time and the password is password, for example, are we thinking about, well, it's not just good enough just to ask that to happen, but what controls do we have in place around that? And of course, it's only where it's relevant. We have to think about where it's relevant and where more control may be required in terms of two-factor authentication and gaining access from an external location or something like that. So it's all based on risk. And what about in terms of internet usage? Do we allow it in our business? And what we're talking about here is in terms of not wasting time, but we're talking here about potential threat in terms of where people may go. So it's important we understand our internet usage and maybe even have an internet usage policy within our organisation on what people can access or not. And similarly with email. Do we have a rule within maybe a form of policy that says what we allow and don't allow within email usage? Do we not allow the use of our corporate emails when sending personal email information? What about sending images and videos and links? Do we get wary about people opening personal emails using our company infrastructure where there can be links that may cause additional risk to our business? What about in terms of security incidents? What's expected of the individuals within our organisation when such a thing occurs? Is it important that they raise this, and who do they go to with their concerns? You know, it may be that they have seen this email and not acted upon it, but simply just deleted it and forgotten about it. But someone else could receive the same thing 24 hours later and click on it. So if that person acts previously, if they had acted on this by informing someone within the business or sharing it within the business to all employees, making them aware of this potential threat, then the likelihood of that situation occurring is reduced. So, around responsibilities is ensuring your PC is getting antivirus updates and patches. This may be controlled by your IT infrastructure, but it may be something you have to enforce. What about in terms of locking your systems when you leave to go out for lunch or to attend a meeting? What about at the end of the day? Are there rules around switching the systems off at the end of the day? What about in terms of storage of information storage devices, laptops, portable drives, USBs? What's the rules within the organisation in terms of how that's controlled? Is it kept under lock and key? What about in terms of people that travel within your organisation, and that travel may just simply be commuting to and from the office? Do they work when they're travelling? Do they open up their laptop? Do they simply use their laptop to watch a video or read information that might be relevant to them outside of work? So it's important to recognise that if they're doing that, how they're accessing that information through 4G or Wi-Fi technology, and what's the potential for a threat. What about in terms of people reading confidential information over someone's shoulder? So someone could be on a bus or a train accessing personal records to do with national health or government, passport agency, whatever that may be, something of quite personal nature, but someone may be looking over their shoulder, could be taking photographs on a smartphone. Do we think about the rules within our business that's appropriate for when people are outside travelling? What about in terms of backups of our data? Is this driven automatically? Do we have systems where the backup goes directly to the cloud? Or what about the situation where we don't have backups, or we think we have, but we don't check it? And ultimately we're relying on possibly a server, standalone server that goes down, and we lose access to our information. What impact could that have on our business? Who had the responsibility to drive the backups and control the backups? Did that person leave? Have they been on holiday? Have they left the business completely and no one else has taken on that responsibility? What about in terms of your security obligations, in terms of access to data, access to offices? What about our non-disclosure agreements we may have in place with employees, in place with partners, in place with joint ventures and clients? How well are we enacting on those agreements? And what about if we're an organisation that works for a corporate body? Are there certain requirements from a corporate level that have to be driven down into our organisation? Okay, so there's a couple of scenarios I've thrown in here just to get people thinking about the what if situation. So these scenarios are in here just to get people to, when they're looking at this video, maybe just to pause for a few minutes, look at these scenarios and have a think for themselves. There are no right or wrong answer associated to these scenarios. It's very relevant to your business, the risks associated to your business. It might get you thinking about other potential scenarios within your business and what levels of control you need to have in place. So let's think a little bit more about the impacts. We're talking about the things that we want to try and put in place and the benefits and why we need to do it and the responsibilities. But let's think about the impact. In the first half of 2019, there were 3,800 publicly disclosed breaches within the UK. About 4.1 billion compressed files were leaked. And this is only associated to the information that was disclosed. You know, this is information that was reported upon. So the top 3 issues associated to these security breaches were virus or spyware or malware, people doing impersonation of a company or a person within a company trying to gain access to accounts or secure information, or denial of service accounts. So where a system has gone down, where a portal has gone down, where there has been an attack on someone's credentials to get access to a system. And think about this, could be your customers, for example. There's been a number of significant, and this data is a little bit out of date, but there have been a number of significant fines that we're aware of around the globe, where we're talking millions upon millions of dollars and pounds and euros with different organisations, and some organisations that we're very familiar with. Tesco Bank, British Airways. You know, so many of these companies that retain personal data, but we have to also think about your company, what type of data you retain. You may not contain and hold a lot of personal data like these organisations, but you may retain enough data associated to your customers and associated to your contracts that may have an impact. So based on the information that's out there, the average cost of every leaked record is around £100 to £200, okay? And this may or may not include the hidden costs as well. So the other activities that have to go on to correct this and put it right, the reputational impact that could occur. It's worth knowing, the UK currently is the 6th target of data breaches, but also in terms of the 6th in terms of offenders that are reporting as well. Data attacks are definitely on the increase. There is no question. We all know this, we see it, we hear about it on a regular basis. It's estimated that we generate around 4,000 to 5,000% more data by the end of 2020 than 2010. That data has to go somewhere. It has to be transferred from one source to another. It has to be stored in some locations. So the more data we generate, the more methods we use to access it and transfer it, the more possibility there are for security threats associated to this, cyber attacks, and the potential for things to go down. And it's important to recognise that often the threat may not be the loss of the data. It may not be the penalty associated to that, like we spoke about with British Airways and things and those other threats. It could be the effort and time your organisation has to put in to get your business operations back to normal. And we talk about this often as the iceberg effect. So above the surface are the things that you're aware of in terms of what that impact has caused. It may be your customers are not happy. It may be that you have to inform the regulator about the situation. So there are a bunch of different things. They might have to invest money in more improvements. But underneath the surface, there are significant other and often more time-consuming and costly efforts that are required associated to the impact of these issues that happen to do with information security. And it could be, these are just some examples, it could be within your business or very specific to your organisation only. So we have to think about when these occur, the next time these occur, put a true cost of the impact on it. Put a true cost associated to who was involved and for how long, and how much investment was required to correct it And what impact, it's very difficult to put a price on it, but what impact do we think it had on our reputation? So in terms of 27001, I'm just going to run through some examples of some of the clauses. These are the sections within the standard that we can be certified again. And remember, 27001 is the most widely used international standard associated to information security management. There are other cyber essential things going on within the UK and around Europe where we can go to a level to show that we're meeting sort of minimum basic requirements. But in terms of the high level certifying requirements, 27001 is probably still seen as the highest level associated to that. So one of the things I'm going to say is that there are many clauses within ISO 27001 that are actually very similar to 9001, the quality management system standard. Why is that? Well, many of the requirements within a quality management system, a health and safety management system, and an information security management system are similar. We require to understand the context of our business and what the threats and stakeholders and impacts could be internally and externally. We require to have leadership commitment to putting this in place and making it work. We require to plan on how we're going to achieve these things. We have to look at our risks and our emergencies. We have to think about our support infrastructure that's required in terms of making it work. The people, the equipment, the facilities, the assets, the software. We then have to think about our operational activities and what impact they could have. And of course, we want to be able to analyse our performance associated to information security. How well have we done in terms of our objectives? How well have we done in terms of threats that have occurred to us and what impact they've had? And then of course we want to improve upon our systems, practices, behaviours. And that's the same across a multitude of standards, multitude of ISO standards that we want to try and follow that plan, do, check, act analogy. So these few slides that we've put together here, please take a bit of time to look at them. You'll be able to see the similarities if you have an ISO 9001 or a other ISO standard in place. You'll be able to see how similar many of those clauses are associated to that, and how simple it can be for certain sections of 27001 to be put in place. However, it is important to make you aware that there are additional levels of control required, as you'd imagine, for information security. And these are referred to as the annexes within the Information Security ISO 27001 standard, and they go from A5 to A15. A5 refers to the information security policies that we have to put in place, how these are developed, how they are implemented, made available to people, and how they are supported and regularly reviewed. And then we've got our organisational information security. What about the duties and the roles and responsibilities within our business? What about the use of teleworking, working from home, mobile devices that we may access in different locations? What about the roles and responsibilities within our human resources? What about in terms of the data that we retain within our business? Do we have to do background checks on people we bring in? What about in terms of validating information and maybe looking at contractual and legal requirements and setting confidentiality agreements in place? What about in terms of making people aware when they join our business of what our information security management system is, why it's there, why it's important, and the impact it could have if people don't follow it? And of course, in terms of human resource security, what about when people leave the four walls of our offices? What about when people travel? What about when people go on holiday? What about when we terminate or they end their contract with us? How do we control that? And what about our assets? So how those assets are controlled, how they may be regularly tested and reviewed, including, of course, those assets meaning our data storage locations that we have, including our mobile USBs and things like that, and including, of course, our mobile devices that we may record information on. What about in terms of how we dispose of assets? So it's not just a case of throwing them in the trash. If those assets have got access or retain confidential information or secret information, what methods do we take in terms of the management of disposal? What about in terms of access control? How do people get access within our business and outside of our business, our customers, our suppliers? How do they get access to information that we grant them access to? And how do we control that? And how do we review it on a regular basis? How do we ensure that the rules that we set associated to access control are followed? And what about in terms of encryption? Is there a requirement to encrypt some of the data that we hold when we transfer it, when we store it? What about associated to the encryption, associated to information that we develop, that we may share with third parties? How is this managed? And our physical and environmental security. So in terms of how people can get access to our laptops. And we have to think about that also for people working from home, where their children may be able to access their laptops if they're not locked and get access to data or information, or other people if you're in a shared environment, working in a hotel, for example. And in terms of operational security, it should link very closely with the methods and how we work. So our operational processes should link very closely with our operational security activities and how we ensure they work. And then around communication security. So do we ensure the policies and the processes and how we communicate internally and external to the company? The methods and how we communicate, and remember, we could be talking about communication by email, we could be talking about communication by video conference, by telephone, whatever that may be. We have to have methods of controlling that and rules around how that should happen. What about if we have to purchase systems, software, hardware? What methods do we have in place of how we acquire systems and maintenance services associated to our systems? What controls do we have in place or related to that? And then in terms of our suppliers might simply just provide us with raw material for our production line. Or we may have suppliers that develop our portals, develop our websites, develop information security systems that we rely upon heavily. How close is our relationships with them? And what controls do we have to evaluate these suppliers when we bring them on and work closely with them to monitor them? And what about in terms of personnel within their organisation that may leave, that have been granted access to our systems? How do we ensure that our suppliers are mimicking our requirements in terms of these controls? And then, of course, when there is an incident, what do we have in place? What have we prepared for so that when an incident does occur, and we may do tests and drills on these, like we would associated to fire emergency evacuation or a serious rescue activity that's required, maybe from a confined space or something. How do we test these so that when an incident occurs, we know that we have the practices in place to check that it fundamentally works so that we can get back to normal business activity, so the continuity of our business activities is fairly seamless, or as seamless as possible. And importantly, we have to demonstrate through incidents that we investigate them and put in corrective and preventative measures, ultimately so they do not come back and hurt us again. And of course that links with our business continuity management overall. And compliance. What is it that we have to comply with within our business? It's important that we have to recognise our compliance requirements associated to information security. It may be that they might be fairly low. It may be that we just simply have to meet the requirements of GDPR and personal data management for our employees' records that we hold. But what about if we hold other information? What about if we take payment by credit card? What about if we retain information on our clients' personal data? What if our business is providing a service, a software product or a hardware product to our clients where they keep important information on there? So it's important we understand what our compliance requirements are and demonstrate how we meet those compliance requirements. And often using things like internal auditing is a fantastic way of doing that. Okay, we have came to the end of this session. Thanks very much for listening. I'd like to remind you again to follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube channel, where down below here you'll see lots and lots of different videos and webinars that we do. And please remember that we have a free resources area on our website where you can access lots of example processes and templates that we talk about in this video and lots of our other videos. Thanks very much.